Music theory, a better method, and the argument for it. Primary objective, to learn music theory in the most practical and intuitive way possible, geared towards actually playing our instrument. In our case, that instrument is going to be the guitar. However, the concepts learned here do apply to other instruments as well, including even the piano. And I say even the piano because sometimes as guitarists, we get a little bit jealous because it seems like music theory was basically built with a piano at hand instead of a guitar in hand, leading us to say, hey, we need something a little bit different over here because the guitar is structurally different than the piano. And of course, it is the case that learning things a little bit differently depending on the structure of the instrument could be beneficial. However, the concepts we're learning here do apply fundamentally to both the piano as well as the guitar, as well as other instruments. The primary question that we're going to be asking and going back to will be, if we built our system today of music theory, would it look the same as the system that we currently have, which was constructed over time as new innovations happened? And my argument would be no. If we were going to start from scratch with everything we know today and build our music theory system, we would come up with something that is way more efficient than what we have built over time and what we have traditionally. Now, if you accept that argument, that leads to the question of, well, if I learn things in the most efficient way, are the benefits, are the gains enough to outweigh the problems of having to communicate the information in a traditional system or having to translate that information? Those are going to be the questions that we're going to be coming back to over and over again. My argument is, of course, going to be, yeah, it's going to be worthwhile. It's worthwhile to learn things in the most efficient and fastest way possible and then work to bridge the gap between the way we're learning it in the most efficient way and the way we have to communicate with it. And these days, that becomes even easier because we have AI, we have computers at this point in time. Therefore, translation, even of very complex languages, can be done very easily. So the idea that we're stuck with a system that's less efficient because of the historical precedents is becoming weaker and weaker given the fact that the translation is easier and easier. That's going to be the crux of the argument. So the methods then are, rather than relying solely on traditional views, we shift our approach, not by thinking only in notes, though that remains useful. So I'm mainly visualizing the fretboard. This works for the piano as well, but I'm going to be visualizing the fretboard because that's my instrument. And so I'm going to be thinking, what do I want to do on the fretboard? I want maneuverability on the fretboard. I want to open up the fretboard. I want to learn as fast as possible to be able to maneuver not just in open position, but up and down the fretboard. How can I do that? Well, a lot of times people say, well, you need to memorize all the notes on the fretboard. That'll open up the fretboard. Now, memorizing the notes is a good thing to do. If you become more and more advanced at the guitar, you clearly would like to memorize all the notes on the guitar. But my argument is that that is not the most efficient way to learn to maneuver up and down the fretboard, to open up the fretboard to actually play something up and down the fretboard. Why? Because we typically focus in on scales, which are going to be 7 out of the 12 notes. We'll talk more about that shortly. The next thing we could do is say, by relying on scale or mode shapes based on relative positions alone. So on a guitar in particular, because it's completely symmetrical, which is a little bit different than the piano, so I'll touch on the piano later, but on the guitar we have a completely symmetrical grid system such as an Excel sheet. Now there's a little bit of a tweak in the tuning. We'll talk more about that later, but in general, everything can be moved up and down in basically a symmetrical way. That leads to a method of guitar based on shapes. We can learn different scale shapes. Now, when we think about the music theory concept, note all the different scale shapes that come into play. We end up having, all of the major scales, which if we go through the 12 notes, ends up with 12 different scales. And if we look at each of the 7 notes within those scales, we end up with 7 modes. So you end up having to think that you have to learn 7 times 12 different scale shapes. So that's where it becomes overwhelming. So I'm not opposed to the idea of learning from a shape perspective. That clearly makes sense. The problem is the renumbering of the shape based on the scales that we're using as we move through the different modes. I'll talk more about that in a second. So what do we do instead then? What are you proposing? Well, I would say we visualize the instrument in terms of fixed modal notes. That is viewing the fretboard through the modal anchor points that do not change in diatonic plane. What are you talking about? What does that mean? Well, I'm basically just saying we're still looking at the shape, but I'm not going to keep renaming all of the relative points on the shape as we move through different modes or different scales, like a C major to an A minor scale. I'm not going to renumber all of the notes if they're related, meaning they're in the same diatonic shape. The same master shape will be the same. So we'll see more of that in a second. So that's going to be the basic idea though. If I'm learning the fretboard, how are you going to learn the fretboard? 3 primary ways that's going to come to your mind. I'm going to learn all the notes on the fretboard, or I'm going to learn all of the relative scale shape position and chord shape positions on the fretboard, which means I'm renumbering every time I think about a new shape. Or I would say you learn the nodal points, the actual 7 notes in relative position on the fretboard. My argument is that if you learn that way, then you actually can learn one master shape that is the same through all relative modes and that is completely shiftable up and down the guitar. So there's basically only one shape that you need to learn, in essence, that's maneuverable. Now, I'm not saying that if you learn this, in 5 seconds you can just learn this and we'll learn all of guitar theory in a 5-minute video, or that's not what I'm saying. I'm trying to say that because why isn't that what I'm saying? Because when you actually put your fingers on the guitar, even though you know in principle that you can, in essence, copy and paste the shape up and down the guitar, it doesn't mean that when you tactilely touch the guitar that you're going to be able to move up and down that easily. But if you know conceptually what the goal is, that means that you can train your fingers a whole lot faster than if you have no idea of what the goal is. If you're trying to switch yourself between going through 12 times 7 different scales instead of realizing that they're all the same shape, then you're not just dealing with a problem of training your fingers, you're dealing with the problem of having to mentally visualize and do a lot of mental gymnastics that you don't need to do, right? That's the point. Okay, so this means, so each mode is tied to a stable note. We'll talk about this in a second. The modular identity of a note remains constant up and down the fretboard. So I'll show you this in a second. So you're thinking to move horizontally in modal structure rather than vertically in position shapes. So let me show you what I mean. Now we're going to go through this in detail, but I have to give you a little bit of theory here just to give you the main crux of the argument, and then we'll get into to each step in more detail if you would like to. I'll go into, you could follow along if you want to in later presentations. But don't worry about the numbers here at this point in time. I'm just going to say there's 12 notes. 12 notes in our musical alphabet. And what do we do with a scale? We typically first think about the C major scale, and we use a formula picking some of those notes. Now you might ask why that formula seems arbitrary. We can get into why the formula works. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but right now I'm just going to accept a priori in Western music. I'm going to accept as just the way it is that we use this formula to take 7 of those 12 notes. So if I list those, we can call that a scale. If we start from the C, we call that a C major scale. So these 7 notes in this order is the C major scale. If I label the relative positions of the C major scale, the C here would be a 1, the D would be 2, the E would be 3. It would just be in order from top to bottom. Don't worry about these numbers. Those are the numbers of the notes. Just imagine we have a numbering system from top to bottom, 1 through 7. That would be the scale. However, if I moved and I said, well, now I want to have the scale be the D, that's my tonic now. What do? Well, we just renumber it. We say that's now the 1. So we just have a relative numbering system, same 7 notes, but now this is the 1, and I say 1, 2, 3, 4 through 7. What if I want to have the E as the tonic? Well, then we just start at the E and say that's the 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so remember the 3 ways that we can kind of try to memorize the fretboard. I can try to memorize the fretboard by all 12 notes on the fretboard, but that's not really going to help me to play in a diatonic key, whether it be C major, Dorian, Phrygian, right? Because it's not going to tell me which notes fit in a particular shape. What I want to do, then the other way I can learn is by note. So I could learn all of the notes in the C major and related modes, the diatonic notes in C major. That would allow me to play not only C major, but I can see the shape and play around any of the other notes in there. So that's actually more flexible to play within a particular key. However, it will not allow me to shift from playing from C major and related modes to say D. Like if I wanted to play in the key of B and the related diatonic modes, then learning the notes of the C major won't be transferable. I can't copy and paste them up. So what can I do instead? I could learn the relative nodal positions. I'm not going to name this note as a C when I look at it on the fretboard. That's not the primary way I see it. I'm not going to see it as relative position number 1, but rather I'm going to see it as the node, the Ionian node. If I see the Ionian node, that doesn't change. If I see the Dorian node, that doesn't change. Now, don't let the terminology mess you up, because when we look at modes, you might think of a mode as a scale, right? And it is, you can think of it as a scale, but you can also think of it as the point. It's usually what we renumber to be the 1, and then we count from there to get the modal scale. So we'll talk more about that later. The point I want to talk about now is just that the way you want to memorize the fretboard to make it as flexible as possible, as maneuverable as possible, is to not memorize the notes. That's not where you spend most of your time. To not memorize relative positions and scale positions. That's not where you maximize your time, but to memorize the nodal points, because that's completely maneuverable within the diatonic modes as well as across scales. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a fretboard. I have the top or heavy E string on top. That's how I do the fretboards, because I think it maps onto actually what you see from your perspective of the guitar. So this is the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling, and on down. So what I want to point out here is that everything that has something in it is one of these 7 notes. The ones that are blank are representing the frets on the fretboard that are the 5 notes that aren't in our scale. So in theory, if I just memorized this shape, now I know it's a little complex to memorize it across the entire fretboard, which we typically break the fretboard in the guitar into like 5 shapes, or you can think of it, 3 note per string, whatever. We'll talk about that later. But the idea would be, if you memorize this one shape across the guitar, then you can play within diatonic scale if you just don't hit any of the blank notes. And you should be playing something that sounds diatonically good. It's in the same basic key. That's going to be the general idea. Okay, so let's look at our 3 ways for memorizing the fretboard then. What if I memorize the fretboard by note? Here's a C. Well, here's a C right here. Now, if I memorize the note that is a C note, then obviously the C notes will always be the same on the fretboard. And so if I'm playing in C major and relative modes, that works actually quite well, right? Because I can say, okay, I know where the C is. If I move to the Dorian, let's say I make the Dorian the 1, I want to be playing around this Dorian mode, or the Aeolian, which is the minor scale. What if I want to play in the minor scale? Well, if I play in the minor scale, here's the A is the relative minor. So the C doesn't change. So it's not like the C changed. So if I learn the notes, that actually works well for me to be able to play within any of the modes, because I've memorized all the notes. Where doesn't it work? It doesn't work if I want to transfer it to another key. So if I learn all the notes in C major and related modes, but then I want to play in the key of D, for example, you can see what happens here is this shape shifted up, right? So it's the same shape here as here. You can see the relative positions up here, boom, 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 and then doot, here, dut, 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 dut. But the notes are different. So this note, I learned it as C here. It's not going to be C anymore because now it's a D because I'm playing in D major. So if I learn the notes then that are in a particular key like C major, that works for me to maneuver through the 7 modes, but it doesn't work for me to copy and paste, to shift up through the 12 different positions. All right, what's my other option? My other option is that I could learn the relative position, meaning if I'm in C major, I can play the relative position, that's the 1, and this A over here is the 6 of that scale. Okay, so that actually works well if I shift to a different key. So if I go to D, then I can still say, well, look, that's relative position 1 here, which makes sense. 6 represents the 6th position relative to the C major scale. In other words, if we just number the scale, we have 1 as C, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This A note represents the 6th of the C major scale. Now that works beautifully as we move to the D major scale. If we constructed the D major scale, the 6th position would then be the B note, which is still having the same relative position within the shape. So therefore, if we learn the relative positions, that works great as we kind of copy and paste up the fretboard, as we go from playing in a C major and related diatonic modes to playing in like a D major and related diatonic modes, or D sharp major and related diatonic modes, and so on and so forth. However, it breaks down when you're playing within the modes of the same diatonic system. In other words, if I have to change the numbering system as I make the D the tonic, that means I have to memorize the same fretboard with a different numbering system. So in other words, let's say that we're playing in the related A minor, which is the related minor scale position to the C major, which you can also call the Aeolian mode. Well, that would mean that this would now have to be called scale position 1 instead of scale position 6. So that means even though the entire shape is the same, I'm remembering a different numbering system as I go through the different modes, which also means, because that's how we construct chords, that whenever I go from one chord to another, I'm basically visualizing as though I'm playing in a completely different scale, when in actuality I'm playing within the same shape. So what would be a better system to do? What would give you the most flexibility to move through the fretboard? It would be to learn the relative node, what I'm calling node positions, which you can call the modes. So the modes are a little bit confusing. Most people are intimidated by them because of the names, the Greek names that are assigned to them. But later we'll apply a numbering system to them. You also might get confused because the modes sound like a scale. If I say that something is a mode, I think it's a set of 7 notes. But we can think of it as the starting point, right? A point within this system. Each of these are going to be a point, a node within a system. And if I memorize all of the nodes, if I memorize that relative position, not as the C note, because that's not transferable as I go through different scales, or as a relative position, because that's not transferable as I go through the modes, but rather as the nodal point of the Ionian, notice that is going to be the same even if I change. If I go to the Dorian mode, if I play in the Dorian scale, I'm not going to change the fact that that's still the node of Ionian node. It's still the Ionian node, right? If I go to Mixolydian, if I go to the related minor scale, then I'm not going to then change I'm going to apply a numbering system to it later, but I'm not going to stop calling this the Aeolian node. The Aeolian node is still there. So that means that I can learn this one shape, which applies out to all the diatonic nodes. I can play through all the diatonic nodes, just changing the center point that I'm playing around using the same master shape. And if I move to a different diatonic set of notes, meaning D major, for example, and all the related notes to them, you can see it copies and pastes beautifully as well. So now we can see that the I represents the Ionian mode. So that node now has changed. It's a different note name, but it's the same relative position within the shape. And same over here. This A is a different, is representing the Aeolian node. So if you learn the node positions, that means you just have to learn one master shape. And that one master shape includes all of the 7 modes within it. You're just shifting the nodal points within it. And you can copy and paste that shape up and down to the 12 diatonic scales up and down the fretboard. I think that is unquestionably, from just a learning perspective, to try to unlock the fretboard as fast as possible and as efficiently as possible, the way to go, right? Of the 3 things that you can kind of really start off and focus your time learning, I don't think it should be the notes themselves. I don't think it should be the relative scale positions. I think it should be the nodes, the relative nodal points. And by doing that, you can practice not by starting in the major and minor scale and then branching out to the other modes. You can practice all of the modes at the same time because you're just shifting modal center points. So, and historically, by the way, we'll get into this later, they kind of got this idea that the major scale and the minor scale were the things that they wanted to play in all the time. So the other modes kind of took a back seat. But I don't think that's the case these days. I think most people would say, hey, look, I would like to treat all the modes the same, and because they are all part of the same kind of network, and be able to shift through the modes as I want to be going through the different modes. We'll talk more about that later, but that's my argument, that I think that's going to be the fastest way to go. Now, the same argument applies to the piano, although the piano is a little bit different. I'll touch on that shortly, but the challenge. So this approach contradicts how traditional theory is structured. Now, I'm not saying that everything is wrong. I'm going to tear down we're just going to say, but what we're saying is the way that we're thinking about things most likely is not the most efficient way if we were to build the system from scratch. And we'll see it as it's codified in the theory, meaning the way we label our chords, the way we label our scales, inherently force us away from this modal structure to this renumbering structure, which actually takes longer for us to visualize and open up the fretboard. All right, so music theory evolved historically to prioritize notation and compositional convenience, not necessarily instrument-friendly logic. So in other words, one of the major things, and we'll talk more about this as we go into future presentations and dig into like why were things put together, is going to be that they wanted to try to write down, of course, what they're doing. With music, that is very difficult to do, clearly. It's a lot more easily done in language once we have an alphabet. We had to come up with an alphabet, basically, for music, and once that was codified, put in a textbook, it became static, of course, right? But now, these days, it's just like with language. Once we had a language, the language changes all the time. But once you put it in a textbook, it's much more difficult to change. So once we had the printing press, the changing of language over time didn't happen so much because it's been codified. There's now a master copy of the way it should be, right, or whatever at that point in time. So that means it's more that's great because it's easier to conform to everybody doing the same thing. But it also means that if there are improvements, then it's harder to make the improvements because now it's already put down in paper. Now, remember, one of the things we have now that allows us to possibly do things differently is the computer and the easy ability to translate things, especially things that are complete logic-based, such as music, for example. So, therefore, this journal requires making the case step by step for why the node-based system is objectively more practical for playing. So hopefully I've given you the general idea on a guitar as to why I think this system will open up the fretboard. If you want to stop there and just say, hey, look, I'm going to use that for the fretboard, and I'm going to start to visualize it from a nodal center point, memorize the nodes, and then I'm just going to conform that to the traditional music theory, thinking in scales and thinking the way the normal intervals are structured. You can do that. That is fine. However, you will run into problems because you're going to start to say, hey, look, the way they're writing the thing down forces me out of the nodal centered structure of thinking, because the way the scales are formatted and way the chords are formatted are based on the major and minor scales as though they are the master scales and all the other modes are kind of lesser. And because the numbering system of the scales forces us to think as though we're switching keys all the time, even though we're in the same diatonic key. So what I'm going to do is follow the logic through and say, well, what if I built a full system that was as efficient as I can make it? I'm not I'm a person here, so might not be making the most efficient thing, but as I see it, what would be the most efficient system? And I'm going to follow that through and then make a case for it. Like, why is the current system the way it is? I don't want to tear down the fence without saying, why did they construct the fence? Is it still serving that functional purpose? And then tweak it or adjust things to kind of fix it. That's going to be the general idea. And then the question is, well, if I was to make it more efficient, is it that added efficiency good enough, great enough for me to abandon the way or do something a little bit differently? Because then, of course, I'm going to have to learn to communicate. So I have to bridge the gap. And that's going to be I argue that it would be at least the modal structure, but you can take every step along the way as I follow the logic through and question that question. Is it worthwhile for me to do this point that it's different because it's gonna cause this bridging problem? So exploring why the current system exists, including its historical origins. So as we do this, we'll dig into a little bit of history on this, and I think that's an interesting thing just in and of itself, but we're really doing it from a functional standpoint. Why was it constructed this way? Is it just a convention, or does it have a purpose? And that, given that knowledge, that's the only time you should tear something down or change it, right? I don't want to tear down the fence if I'm just saying, I don't like the fence. I don't figure out why the thing was put up in the first place. So I'm going to try to figure out why they did it this way, even though it doesn't look exactly like the most efficient thing, and then think, is it worthwhile for me to think about it a little bit differently? So offering a clear system of translation between traditional notation and the new node-based visualization. So I'm going to think about a different language, like a little bit slightly different way that we can possibly map things out from a nodal-centered system. And every time we do that, we have to then bridge the gap and say, how can I translate that or move between the two systems so I can communicate, which again becomes a lot easier these days as well, because I'm betting, I know to some extent, that you can basically just say, hey, ChatGTP or whatever AI that you're using, this is the system that I'm using, and I would like you to take this piece of music or whatever I'm looking at and translate it to this system. And it's all logic based. The translation will be very easy typically, or you can do it in reverse, right? You could say, this is the logic that I'm putting in place in my language, ChatGTP, here's the logic. I want you to translate it into the traditional system. It should be able to do that quite easy. So in my perspective these days, the argument that this is traditionally the way it's done, therefore, and even though it's less efficient, we're going to keep doing it that way because that's the standardized way, becomes less and less of an argument given the fact that technology is to the point where translation, even of complex languages, is so easy that it's ridiculous, right? So to me, at this point in time, we should be saying, what's the best system and how do we convert to that best system? How do we bridge the gap? How do we translate? How do we get everything into a system where we can get more people learning music faster, right? That would be better. So the value proposition then, you'll learn faster. So my argument is that if we can prove that one way of learning is objectively better than another way of learning, if we remove the idea of historical baggage and we were just making it with all the knowledge we have today, then you will learn faster with the system that's most efficient. And then the question is, well, then the question is, well, is that speed worthwhile? Does it outweigh the translation issues and the bridging kind of issues? So your understanding will be more transferable across the fretboard. So my argument would be that some of the conventions that have been put in place take on, like, there's implicit assumptions the way things are constructed. One of them being the major scale and minor scale are superior to the other modes, for example, or that the C major is superior to other scales also and whatnot. These are assumptions that I don't think you would make in a normal context. It's all the same, right? And if you learn it without those assumptions, it's like if you were to learn something very simply mathematically and you learn a trick that works, but it doesn't work across the board, right? You're actually blocking yourself later because you're implanting things that aren't exactly right that you'll have to unlearn later. So I'd rather learn things properly from the start, and then even though you have to translate it possibly to conventions that are making assumptions that I think are kind of incorrect but are inside of the language, that's better, right? You'll be able to go further, have a better understanding, and learn it faster. So you'll build your knowledge on a logically consistent, performance-oriented model, even if it diverges from traditional theory. So my goal is to open up the fretboard as fast as possible in as efficient as way as possible, in a way that is scalable as possible, removing as many hurdles as we can as well, not learning things that are incorrect, even if that is going to contradict with the way some of the music theory is listed, because they have implicit assumptions just in the way things are written down, right? So we want to recognize that those implicit assumptions are there, and some of them are kind of are going to lead us to think incorrectly, in my opinion. So along the way, you'll gain a deeper appreciation for how and why music theory are originally built. So we'll look at some history in terms of how it was put together in order to then put together what might be a more efficient system if we had everything we knew today, while still developing tools to reframe it. All right, I want to make a quick look on the piano, because although, again, I'm a guitar player, so I'm going to use the guitar as my example, but I used to think that maybe this is just because the guitar is different than the piano, but no, I don't think that's the case. So I want to take a quick look at the piano and just realize that the piano, like a guitar, has multiple strings that are laid out similar to like one layer on the piano. So the guitar has a grid of kind of like the same layout that you have on a piano, except that the guitar doesn't have different shaped keys, whereas the piano is not symmetrical. So you've got these different key shapes within it. So that means the piano's a little bit easier for me to mentally shift through different scale shapes, right? Because it's all linear. It's going from left to right. And so it might be a little bit easier for me to jump in my mind saying, okay, now I'm in this mode, and now I'm going to C major scale to the Dorian scale or whatever, and renumber the system. But it still takes a lot more work to do that. So in other words, if we are in the key of C major and diatonically the same modes, those are all the white keys. So if you're playing all the white keys, it's pretty obvious that if I go from one scale to another scale, but I'm still playing all the white keys, that they're still kind of related. But I would still argue that mentally you're thinking, why am I renumbering the system? Because I'm playing the same set of notes, the same set of 7 notes that are being repeated out of basically 12. It would be more logical to me to say I'm looking at different center points as my tonic and moving basically the center point around those notes would be easier to see. Now again, that becomes a lot more important on the guitar because that mental gymnastics becomes multiplied by 5, because you have multiple different strings that you're dealing with on the guitar. But the same concept applies here as well. Now, what's different so that means on the guitar, we argued that one master shape will give us all 12 different shapes if we move through the different notes, as well as all the different modal shapes, because there's 7 modes per master shape that we're just going to renumber by node. On the piano, notice that still works within the shape. So if I move from C major to D Dorian or whatever, then I still have all the same concept moving through the same nodes. But on the piano, I actually have to learn a slightly different shape when I go from like C major to D major and related modes. Why? Because the black keys, the same formula applies but the black keys are a different shape. Therefore, just structurally, the way your hand plays, it's going to look different to you. You can't copy and paste. So that means that you still have to learn 12 different scales in general, but it's not 12 times 7 different scales, right? Which is what you would think modally. When you would just think, I would think on the piano, I would think of it as I'm learning 12 different scale shapes that are different because of the interplay between the black keys, and within each of those shapes I have nodal points, the modal nodes, 7 different basic tonic points within those shapes. That's how I'd kind of think of it on the piano. But again, I learned a little bit. I haven't learned basically any piano. I've learned almost exclusively on the guitar, so that's where my point of focus will be. But I do think the concepts apply to the piano.